Hello, Kainatis. Uh, Welcome. This is a special session of Kainati Chai. Okay, so we usually have guests who speak Urdu, but sometimes we also have special guests who speak English, and then our conversation has Urdu subtitles at the end, so or any other language as well, because once you do subtitles, YouTube can also auto translate it. So this conversation is available in multiple languages. So let me introduce our special guest for today. It's Dr. Jill Tarter. So welcome, Dr. Tarter.
Thanks for having me.
So let me give it a brief introduction. Dr. Tarter is the co-founder and chair emeritus of SETI Research at the SETI Institute. And SETI is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And so, as you can imagine, that's the direction we will be having a conversation with. She currently serves on the management board for the Allen Telescope Array. So this is a big telescope that will be dedicated for searching for life elsewhere. She's been awarded multiple things, including exceptional public service medals from NASA, for the Women in Aerospace Lifetime Achievement Award. She's a role model for women scientists as well, and scientists in general as well too. And she's also inducted in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And of course, before I finish the intro, I have to mention that for science fiction fans, she was the inspiration behind the central character in the book and movie Contact. And so we'll ask her a little bit about that as well. So Dr. Tarter, welcome to Kainati Chai.
Oh, again, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So let's, before we talk about potential aliens elsewhere, if you can tell us a little bit about how you got interested in science and also in particular regarding SETI.
Well, I grew up as my father's only son, right? So I was a tomboy and I went hunting and fishing and camping with my dad continuously. My mother, on the other hand, was in the fashion industry. And so when I was around 8, I had this conversation with my dad, and he said, your mother thinks you should be spending more time with her and less time with me. And I thought, that's absolutely ridiculous. It just made me furious. Why couldn't you do both? Why did you have to choose either to do things that were male oriented or things that were female oriented? And so had this long conversation, and of course I cried, because that's how you always get your dad on your side, right? And when we finished, he said, well, if you're willing to work hard enough, I don't see why you can't do anything you want. And so I just pounded my fist and I said, I'm going to be an engineer. And I don't think I actually knew what engineers did at the time, but I knew my dad had a bunch of male friends who were engineers, and they seemed to be enjoying their life. And so that's what I said. And then my dad died a couple of years later, and it just made me stubborn. And I said, I told my dad I was going to do this, so by God, I'm going to do it. And I did. I got an engineering physics degree, and then I looked around and I said, and this is not a fair statement for today, but it was an appropriate statement for the times decades ago. I looked around and I said, if engineers are as boring as my professors, I'm going to find something that's more interesting problems to solve, because the one thing I've gotten is a very good set of problem solving skills. And so I did. I looked around, and this idea that we might right then be on the verge of having the technology that would allow us to detect others' technology if they were out there. It's a question humans have been asking themselves forever. Are we alone? And the thought of being able to work, because of the skill set I had, on one of these very vast and important questions just hooked me, and I've stayed hooked ever since.
So can I ask a question? But why did that question come about? I get the bit about, engineers, a little on the boring side. I can see that. But was there science fiction? Was it sort of like, some other aspect which led you to thinking about uh, finding life elsewhere?
Well, it's a mindset I've had for a long time. Again, before my dad died, we'd go down to the Florida Keys to visit my aunt and uncle, who were literally beachcombers in a place that had very low population, no street lights. So we'd walk along the beach, and my dad would teach me the constellations because he had gotten a degree in astronomy. And I just remember looking up and thinking, gee, along some other piece of water somewhere out there, there would be a young something walking along with its parents and looking up and seeing our sun as a star in its sky. And it just seemed to me that was the most natural thing to wonder if indeed that was happening somewhere else.
Yeah, and it also reminds me in terms of light pollution. I mean, this is just so important, like, to preserving our night skies as well, because those kind of questions, because a lot of people who are growing up in cities, or as the light pollution is increasing, we may not be able to see that many stars. So I think I think that's a
And we
good.
also have to preserve the radio sky.
That's exactly right.
because,
Yeah.
We are using all kinds of different technologies to broadcast microwaves to the earth, and that's making it very hard for radio astronomers to see the sky through all of that noise.
Yeah. So let's get into the SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It has been, I think, over 60 years now. So when the very first sort of like search, it was very simple search, but very first search that happened, it was over 60 years ago. And there has been a sophistication in terms of instruments. Of course, other telescopes are also coming online, including the Allen Array. Uh, what There was an optimism earlier on that we will find maybe signal sooner. Where do you think is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence right now?
Well, I think it's in a really interesting place right now because I think there are two game changers that have happened over the last decade or so. One is extremophiles. We used to think that in order to find life, at least life as we know it, we need to find a place just like Earth, where the temperature was not freezing or boiling and the pH was neutral and there wasn't too much or too little gravity, et cetera, et cetera. But now, as we study these extremophiles, we realize that life can exist in a far greater range of physical conditions than we ourselves as humans can. And so there might be a lot more habitable real estate out there than we originally thought. And then the other game changer is exoplanets, right? So when we started, we knew about 9 planets in our solar system, and we lost one of those. But we didn't know whether planets are plentiful or extremely rare. And at least life as we know it is definitely a planetary phenomena. It evolved on a planet. It was changed by that planet. It, in fact, indeed has changed the planet on the other way around. So whether or not planets existed was a big question. And so one of the first things we did when NASA started the SETI program was to hold a series of workshops about how you might find planets orbiting distant stars. And that was the whole beginning of the exoplanet research and discovery. And so I really feel proud that SETI had a big part in getting that all started. And now, of course, we know the answer is that every star has a planet, at least one. And so planets are plentiful. We don't yet know whether any of them are inhabited, but that's what we're working on.
And you're right about like an extremophile. So these are the microorganisms that live in extreme cold or extreme hot temperatures, and some of them were discovered sort of like in the 1970s, right? And that changed the perspective. So But you can have extremophiles, or the life could still be very common. But what you are looking for in terms of SETI is more is an sort of like life form that can also send signals, for example, that you can detect, right? And there is a big gap between that to getting to life forms that can construct radio telescopes or whatever they have, like, in order to transmit.
Possibly. We don't really know how big that gap is. And so what we started out looking for radio signals, sounded like a good idea. It's still a good idea. But more recently, we've tended to talk about looking for technosignatures. And in parallel, we're looking for biosignatures. And these technosignatures could be anywhere in the electromagnetic spectrum. They could be all different forms of information that is being modified. And so we've tried to make the point that the search for intelligent life beyond Earth is really a search for whatever technology they developed, and that it might not be radio signals at all. It might be something completely different. And so we're very eager to use these new telescopes that are coming online to look at the universe in different ways. I mean, astronomy has this really delightful history of going to funding agencies and saying, I want money to build this new instrument that will do and answer questions X, Y, and Z. But because the instrument is looking at the universe in a new way that hasn't been possible before, historically, the most important things that those new instruments have done is show us something that we didn't expect at all. Yes, they go ahead and answer the questions that we said they were going to answer. That's fine. But they show us something totally unexpected. And it's this wonderful history, and perhaps it's in our DNA. We build something new to look in a new way. We expect to be surprised pleasantly.
So, I mean, I think that's really a fantastic point. And so do you think the way conversation has gone around, in particular, so for people who know, for example, about the Drake equation, right? So this is the probability of finding life elsewhere, and it has certain variables. And towards the end, you also have variables like how long a civilization lasts, for example. And so people have wondered, why haven't we easily found any intelligent civilizations? And so some people say, well, they may destroy themselves, or something gets destroyed, and so on and so forth. Do you think what you are referring to right now, has that changed the context of how we imagine these things? Meaning to say, previously it was a little bit about the language that was used also was intelligent civilizations. And oftentimes people looked at it in the context of not just Earth's history or human history, but oftentimes within the European context as well. So like Stephen Hawking, for example, would say, well, we should not contact because look what happened in the prior colonial context. So I'm just curious that what you are referring to in terms of the change in thinking about how we search has also changed the way we think about civilizations, or sort of like, intelligent beings out there. And how does that impact, or is there any impact on strategies for looking for them?
Well, first of all, the L, that longevity term in the Drake equation, isn't how long the civilization lasts. It's how long the technology continues to perform and modify its environment in ways that we can see. The Romans are long gone, but we still make glass the same way they did, right? The technology has outlived the civilization, and that might be the case of anything that we could detect somewhere else. So again, we've tried to broaden our thinking about what we're looking for and how we might find evidence of someone else's technology. And we understand that the potential amount of search space that we might have to cover to discover something is really vast. When SETI turned 50, years old, I did a calculation and I said, okay, look, there are 9 different parameters that we would have to explore if in fact the thing to find is an electromagnetic signal. And I said, okay, what are the range of each of those parameters? And I just multiplied them together and pretended it was a 9-dimensional volume. And I said, what fraction of that volume have we searched? And it was essentially a part in 10 to the 23, right? So as a better analogy, if you say that the world's oceans are the volume that you have to search, and how much had we searched? Well, it was 1 glass of water out of the oceans. 10 years on, our searches are getting faster and more comprehensive. So I'd estimate, or actually the students at Penn State, Jason Wright students, estimated that it's more like a small hot tub now out of the ocean. But there's still an enormous amount that we need to explore. And it could happen tomorrow. It could happen centuries from now. And so I think the important thing, and what I've changed in terms of my job description and what I'm working on, is to find a mechanism to provide constant, reliable, continuous funding at a low level, as long as we might need to. And so universities figured that out a long time ago, right? Centuries ago, the universities discovered an endowment where you put a large chunk of money aside and you live off the investment of that endowment. And so for me, that's what's needed for SETI right now, to take advantage of the new opportunities in machine learning and the new telescopes that are going on the air, not just for SETI, but to explore the universe. We need to establish an endowment. And so that's what I'm working on.
So basically, in some ways, and again, not just with the radio perspective, but a metaphor would be like, you should always have an ear out for it, like, just in case something comes up. So whatever that ear is, like, and we should keep on looking for it. And of course, that has to do with the reward, because the reward is extraordinary in that sense. I know SETI Institute is also involved with arts as well, and so I want to ask you, not sort of like, obviously we don't know the answer to that, but I wanted to ask you that when you think about intelligent life out there that can potentially have technology or can communicate, is there an image that come to your mind? And again, because we don't know, so one answer is, well, it's unimaginable. But do you think, what kind of imagery comes to your mind thinking about a potential technologically alien civilization or alien?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have an artist in residence program at the SETI Institute because we think the arts are really important. They help scientists to think about their work in from totally different angles. And it's just a way to expand our minds. So STEAM is something that's important to us. It's also important for getting the attention of younger people, right? SETI is sexy, and young kids like dinosaurs and creepy crawly things, and they like to think about SETI too. And the art world allows them at a young age to imagine things that maybe the scientists, being older and knowing too much, haven't allowed their imaginations to conceive of. So art is important. And I've been really pleased at some of the art projects that have come out of the Artist in Residence program at the SETI Institute.
But is there a particular imagery in your mind, sort of like, that you think, well, or is it maybe like in the movie Contact or in 2001 Space Odyssey? Those were the movies which were both sort of like, Carl Sagan was involved in both of those in terms of advising, where like, that, okay, so perhaps the best bet is that it's really when we are thinking in terms of evolutionary processes elsewhere that can lead to complex life forms, it's just hard to imagine? Or is there something that you can sort of like, go like, well, I mean, here are some convergent properties that they may look like X?
Yeah, we often talk about convergent properties and what life might look like elsewhere, given the fact that they had environmental conditions and challenges that were similar to those found in various parts of this planet. I think one of the most enjoyable pieces of science fiction in the movies that I've come across recently was the movie Arrival, because there was a concept in there that if you were going to write in circles, you couldn't do it unless you knew the future. So that idea of writing in circles implies that you know the future. Was a cool thing to me. I hadn't thought about that before.
That's
Yeah,
really,
I don't know what I don't know if it's going to be little green men or big blue women or nematodes. I just don't know. And I, in physics, we often deal with what we call branching ratios. So you do an experiment that could have multiple different outcomes, and you do the experiment over and over and over again to find out what percentage of the time it goes to outcome 1 and what percentage of the time it goes to outcome 2, etc. So these branching ratios are something that I'm very eager to find out for the universe. So how often do you have conditions such as the conditions that were prevailing on this planet when life got started? And how often does life apparently take advantage of those conditions, and what other conditions does it take advantage of? It's just a really big unknown. And one of the reasons that I like talking to public audiences about SETI is that we face enormous challenges on this planet in the near future, right? And these are challenges that are not going to be solved by one individual or one nation state. They are challenges that have to be solved globally. So I think one of the benefits of SETI is that when we talk to the general public about this subject, it helps them to achieve a more global perspective. So it's like holding up a mirror to everybody and seeing all kinds of different nationalities and ethnographies and cultures in that mirror, but coming to the realization that although superficially they might look different, we're all earthlings. And that's really the thing that needs to draw us together to help us to solve these global challenges. And so to the extent that SETI can be an exercise in expanding people's minds and helping them to see themselves in a cosmic context, I think that's useful. I think that will help us manage to find a way to a long future.
Yeah, I think that's and our problems are not going anywhere. So I think that perspective is crucial, is needed.
There's no planet B solution here.
Right.
Because if we don't solve the problems here, we're just going to take them there and trash that place too.
I don't think we deserve to go if we cannot handle ourselves responsibly here. So can I ask you in that vein? I mean, I know, I mean, it went viral. You got into a tiff with, or you didn't get into a tiff with, but Avi Loeb, who has been claiming about the interstellar comet Oumuamua, and he has been claiming that it is likely an alien spacecraft, whereas people who work on it and people who work specifically on the observations of Oumuamua, they have all dismissed those claims. And Avi Loeb has gone on, he's a Harvard astronomer, he has gone on to make other claims that are also, I mean, pushing the boundaries of that. And one of the arguments that he makes is that, well, he is getting funding for SETI. Now, I don't want to just talk about that, but I want to tie it with something that's close to my heart, in the sense that the New York Times coverage of UFOs that was on the front page in 2017, I've followed their coverage pretty closely for the last 5 years or so, and I think it's really terrible service in terms of how science is done and how science is reported. And there are a lot of problems, but it has led to congressional hearings. It has led to pretty much UFOs being covered relative by serious journals like or magazines like New Yorker or New York Times, like a bunch of others. Like everybody had a story on that, and people who are not in the field, not following it closely, now ask this question: so what's up with those UFOs, right? Because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because it was covered in the New York Times, and so then it becomes important because it was covered and because other people talk about it, so it becomes that thing. So how do you you were mentioning about the conversation with the public about this and how important it is in the context of thinking about problems and things like that. What do you think about these things with the Oumuamua, the Avi Loeb's claims, and the UFO stories, and how do you interact with that? Where is the balance, do you think, lies when talking to the public about these things?
Well, there are some people who have done a lot of work on this question recently and have come up with believable explanations for the phenomena that have been observed, and testable. I mean, they can recreate some of the facts. And one of the things that they point out is that these discoveries are often made with instrumentation that's just coming online for the first time, right? It's new instruments. They have characteristics that we're not yet familiar with. We come to understand these imperfections as we use the instruments more, but it's more exciting and probably more profitable to make claims about, oh, it's a UFO. And my take on it is that we have not yet found anything that indicates that the UFO, the unexplained phenomena, has anything to do with alien technology, right? That smoking gun just isn't there. And, Avi has a long series of papers, and there are papers rebutting his papers on this topic. And we'll know soon enough, because if this is in fact a natural phenomena, an interstellar artifact, we discovered it because we had new tools. Probably, if it's an interstellar artifact, they've been coming through our solar system forever, but we just didn't have the tools to find them. And then when we began to get the tools, the one that we found first was the outlier, was the one that was the strangest of all, because that's what your telescope finds, is the biggest or the brightest or the fastest of a group. And then when you begin to understand the group, then you can get more systematic and figure out what the characteristics of that group are. So we'll know if Oumuamua is an interstellar rock, comet, whatever, because now that we know what to look for, we'll find more. If it's a natural phenomena, we will find more, and they will be become obvious what's going on. If in fact it's an alien technology, then it's, I can't make any predictions about how often you might see such a thing. The only thing to say is that, let's, when there's an anomaly in our data, let's get on it before it starts to leave the solar system. Let's try and figure out what it actually is. So take it seriously and use other observational tools to try and track down what's going on early, sooner rather than later.
And I guess the Vera Rubin telescope that will be coming in, and that will be detecting a lot more of these type of things, and other telescopes as well, but that in particular.
Yeah, if they're a natural astrophysical phenomena, yes.
So I have just two more questions. One is, I know, as I mentioned earlier, you have been active in promoting sort of like, a model for women in sciences, in particular in STEM fields and others. Now, in Pakistan, unfortunately, I mean, this is a problem world over, but in Pakistan, unfortunately, that is even more exasperated, sort of like this particular gender inequality, especially in the sciences. Any, I mean, it's a huge problem, and you say, okay, well, we should have more women in sciences and things like that. But is there any advice from you on how to approach this? I mean, it's a systematic, problem. It's sort of like, there has been opportunities are unequal and so on and so forth. So for those women who are thinking about sciences, is there any advice for you from you?
Well, I think there are two things that we should do. One is, as we try and teach science to young people, we shouldn't teach it as a bunch of facts that a whole bunch of old dead white men came up with, right? We should expose children, young people, to the idea that it's such a privilege to be doing science, where you're trying to answer a question that you have posed and you want to know the answer to, rather than doing something that somebody else tells you, well, this is what you should do. So change our representation of what science is and exploration is. And then the other thing that I think is important, as we try to diversify the workforce that's doing this kind of exploration, I think it's important to hire not just one representative of some minority, but at least two, because coming in as an individual, single example, they're going to have a lot of challenges. And if they had a cohort, if they had another person who was similar to them and could relate to the kinds of struggles that they're experiencing, I think we'd have a much better chance of retaining underrepresented communities.
Yeah, thank you. And as a person of color here in the U.S., I mean, I can say that, like, sometimes if you are the only one, then you come to stand for, like, your whole sort of like race or whatever, like, and that's and you feel uncomfortable because you may not want to do that, and so on and so forth. So I think that's acting absolutely correct. So I have one last question, and that is, say if we do detect a signal, right, coming back to SETI, and we know it's from an alien civilization, and I'm talking about like detection, either a signal or we do get a techno signature. Do you think there will be a change in our society on a scale of 100 years or so? I mean, it's a little bit like, I mean, Arthur C. Clarke, one of my favorite books is The Childhood's End, and he imagined sort of like, that how, like, it would change, but there we actually had a spacecraft parked up on the Earth. But I'm just wondering, I mean, like, if we do know, yes, we have the signal, they've not come here. I mean, then it changes the whole thing, because what they look like or how they are and so on and so forth. But if we definitely know there is a signal from alien civilization, do you think we will just shrug it off and say, yeah, sure, and there will be, a SETI will grow as a field, but there may not be that much impact at other places on the scale of 80, 100 years or so? Or do you think it will still have an impact in a particular way?
Well, I think it'll have an impact. It'll have an impact because the thing that we are most curious about is ourselves. And we're going to want to know how we stack up against this other, right? Are there ways that we are superior, or are there things that we could learn from an other? And I think it will change us profoundly. We're going to want to know how we fit into this universe. And are we getting towards the end of our existence, or are we yet in an adolescent phase? And will cultural evolution, as Steven Pinker suggests, make us evolve to be kinder and gentler in the future? The thing that I worry about with the detection of some signal or technosignature that requires some instrumentation is that we don't end up in this north-south divide, so that only one hemisphere can actually see the place on the sky or the event that we're talking about, and then the other hemisphere becomes a have-not. I really wish that we could go into this with an opportunity to share all the results and understand that we really can trust the scientists to make this a global research project, and that what we find will be shared, even with those places that cannot literally observe the phenomena.
That's a really interesting. I'd not thought about it. Sort of like, that, yeah. I mean, people who cannot see it potentially as well, that they would feel left out from it. But it also assumes that people who can see it would feel that they are more privileged, right? I mean, there is that assumption in there, or sort of like,
feel that they have a responsibility.
Obviously,
right?
Yeah,
to share.
That's correct. Well, Dr. Trotter, thank you so much for your time, and obviously, I mean, I just hope that by the time we put this online, we would have detected another signal, a signal, like, from intelligent beings, and so we would have to say, well, this is completely obsolete, all of our conversation in that sense.
Okay, I'll go along with that wish.
But thank you very much for your time and for this conversation.
Okay, been my pleasure. Bye-bye.